In 1848, a man in Yerushalayim on a journey to Judaism was devastated when told he must desecrate Shabbos because, despite undergoing a bris, he wasn't yet considered Jewish until completing the final step of conversion, which is immersion in the mikveh. His heartbreak ignited a halachic controversy, which we'll explore in this class. We'll uncover the identities of the key figures involved and delve into the moving story of a man willing to sacrifice everything for his newfound faith. In the 1800s, there was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yosef Schwartz. He grew up in Germany, and as many Rabbanim, he then moved to Eretz Yisrael and lived in Yerushalayim. He came to Yerushalayim in 1833, and he lived there for the last 30 years of his life. When he came to Eretz Yisrael, he actually added a hey to his name. Instead of being called Yosef, he now went by Yehosef. There's in Tehillim, it calls Yosef Yehosef, and Chazal say that because he was Mekadesh Shem Shemayim Baseser, because he showed his loyalty to Hashem even when no one was looking, so therefore a hey was added to his name, demonstrating, representing Shem Hashem. So that's the meaning of Yehosef in Sefer Tehillim. So I'm not entirely sure, but Reb Yosef Schwartz decided that he wanted to add that hey to his name, hence the word Yehosef. Anyway, he has a sefer of Tshuvos that's called Divrei Yosef, and where he addresses halachic issues, and he tells the following story that we're going to read now. This is from Chelek Beis Siman Chav Daled. B'shnas Tov Reish Ches, in the year 1848, b'chodesh Adar, in the month of Adar. Nisyahed Ger Tzedek Poi Ir HaKodesh. Nisyahed, he became Jewish. A Ger Tzedek became Jewish here in Yerushalayim. V'nimail b'yoim Gimel, and he had the bris, which is a crucial element of the conversion process. He had it on a Tuesday. U'v'yoim HaShabbos HaSamuch, on the following Shabbos, Ba'aloi shliach bezdin mikol Ashkenazim, a shliach of the bezdin from the Ashkenazi Jewish community in Yerushalayim came to him. Remember, at this time in Yerushalayim, there are two communities. There's the Sephardic community with their Rabbanim. There's the Ashkenazi community with their Rabbanim. So a shliach bezdin came on Shabbos from the Ashkenazi community. V'tzivaloi b'shem ha-bezdin, and commanded this convert in the name of the bezdin. And we'll see what he commanded in a second. But immediately, Rabbi Yosef Schwartz says that kichesh loi, this was a lie. There was no meeting of the Bezdin. There was no agreement amongst the members of the Bezdin that what this shliach was about to say was important. It was only one of the Rabbanim's position. But when he came, he didn't say one of the rabbis said. He said the Bezdin said. What did he say? That this Ger Tzedek has to, who already had his bris on Tuesday, he has to violate Shabbos. He must do a malacha on Shabbos. Why? Because a Gentile who keeps Shabbos is chayiv misa. More on that later. For now, we'll just suffice with the fact that a non-Jew is not allowed to keep Shabbos. You had your bris. However, you did not yet have the next step of your conversion, and that is the tefillah in the mikveh. You didn't have that, and so therefore you're still a Gentile, so you're not allowed to keep Shabbos. Vayemoin hager vayoimar, the ger refused, and he said, Haloi kama shonim ani nishmarti malasas malacha b'yom Shabbos kodesh. In fact, it's already a few years before I formally converted that I've been observing Shabbos. Whether that was right or wrong is not relevant for our topic today. But he's just saying, I've been keeping Shabbos for a long time. How much more so now? I've already entered the covenant. I'm already close to Hashem. Because I received my bris. Definitely shloi asa malacha. There is no way I'm going to violate Shabbos by doing a malacha today. Vayoymar hashliach, the shliach of Bezdin responded, Shabigzeiras Bezdin, that by the command and the decree of the Bezdin of the koyach haTorah, and with the full power of Torah, muchrachat alases malacha, you must do a malacha. V'chol zman shaloi tavalta adayin, because as long as you have not immersed in the mikvah, eincha b'chlal Yehudi, you are not Jewish. V'al karchai huchrach lichtov, and so he forced him to write. V'kosav shmoi, and this ger wrote his name, b'loshain v'ksav ha'amim, not his Jewish name, but his Gentile name, and not in the Hebrew script, but in some foreign script. V'kosav b'dema, and he wrote this crying, shabacha, with tears. He was crying, saying, Alma ina Hashem zois liyodai. Why did God make this happen to him? L'chalol Shabbos. His first Shabbos as a Jew in his mind, and instead of being able to celebrate it normally, he is forced to be mechalol Shabbos. L'machrosai, the next day on Sunday, noida hadavar be'ir bein talmid chachamim. All of the scholars heard about what happened. V'isramu al hadayan hanal, and they were enraged and upset by this lone judge, this lone dayan who sent a shliach. In fact, it was so bad, Uchamat Bikesh Harav Rishon Letzion, the Rishon Letzion. This is a name of the official rabbi recognized by the Turkish authorities in Eretz Yisrael. So he had, going back even earlier than this Kufa, he had the name Rishon Letzion, and so the Sephardic rabbi, whose name at this time in 1848 was Chaim Avram Ganin, V'chol Chach Mekala Sfardim, and all of the Svardim, may Hashem protect them. They wanted Ligzar Olav Nazifa. They wanted to do a Nazifa. A Nazifa means a reprimand. In Yodedeyan, Simin, Shin, Lamed, Dalid, there is a discussion over there about, there's a concept of a Cherem, there's a concept of a Nidui, then there's a lesser type of thing that's called a Nazifa, and that is where it's like where a person of prominence calls out certain behavior as being incorrect. And the Shulchan Aruch discusses there what the person who received this reprimand, what he needs to do as a result. So it didn't happen, but it almost happened. So we see this major controversy that was happening at this time in 1848. What a sad story, what a poignant story of this particular individual. And the question that we want to explore over here is, it's a little bit odd for one rabbi to act alone. Why would one rabbi act alone on something of the sort? Why not consult with your colleagues and make the decision together with them? And as we move along, we're going to gain a little more clarity into this particular detail. But for now, what we want to do is we want to understand the basics of the psak. And in fact, the basics of the psak is not too difficult to comprehend. It rests on two principles. Principle number one is the Gemara in Yevamos, Daf Mem Vav, which discusses the following. Chachamim Oimrim, the sages say, although there are some dissenting views, but it's not the view of the Chachamim. Specifically, they say as follows. Tov al v'lo mal, if a person immersed in the mikvah, took in the conversion process, but did not have a bris yet, or on the other hand, did it the other way. Mal, they had their bris, v'lo taval, and that's our case. That's our case. Where there was a circumcision, but there was no immersion, then the din is, ein ger, they are not counted as a convert, ad sheyimal v'yitpal, they need to do both. And that's the order that it's normally done. The halacha is first we do the milah, then we do the tefillah. In this particular case, there is no controversy over the fact that the milah happened, the tefillah did not happen, and so if you follow the shita of the chachamim, and this is how the poskim all paskin, this person is not a ger. That's principle number one. Principle number two is what we alluded to before. Let's see it now in the source, the Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Nun Ches Amid Beis, where Reish Lakish says as follows. Oivid kechavim sheshavas, and obviously in the early editions, meaning in the manuscripts and the early prints, it didn't say this. It said goy sheshavas, a non-Jew who kept Shabbos, chayev misa, is liable to receive the death penalty. The Rambam, when he discusses this, says that it just means not that we literally execute this person judicially, but we call him over and we tell him that, by the way, theoretically, conceptually, you're chayev misa. Okay, but we don't need to get into that right now. The bottom line is, he's not allowed to do it. Shanemar, where is this derived? Why? What's wrong with a Gentile observing Shabbos? We had a pasuk in Parashas Noach, where it's talking about the seasons and the regulation of the world, the planets. And it says, V'yom v'layla lo yishboisu, day and night, and the seasons are not going to take a break. Well, Reish Lakish says that just like the sun and the moon and the stars and the sunrise and the sunset's not allowed to take a break, so too it is for the people of the world as well, the Gentiles, that they also are not allowed to take a break. God created us to perform, to do things, to get things done, to make the world better. And so therefore we need to be busy with that, to take a full day. and to rest is inappropriate. This is what Reish Lakish says. Amar Ravina. Ravina says, by the way, it's not only if it's Shabbos, afilu sheni b'Shabbos, even if it occurs on a Monday. What Rashi means by that is, even if there's no religious connotation over here, even if it's not like we're setting up a new day for a new religion that's going to be their type of Sabbath. No, even if it's done on a Sheni b'Shabbos, because Rashi is referring to the fact that obviously Sunday is observed as a day of rest by others. So Rashi seems to be saying, even if it's not that way, even if it's Sheni b'Shabbos, choosing a random day, stripped of any religious context, still it's a problem. Why is it still a problem? Because the issue over here, according to Rashi, is nothing but the fact that we were created to create and perform. And so therefore we don't have a right to observe Shabbos. If you take the Gemara in Yevamos, the Gemara Sanhedrin, you put it together, this rabbi whose name we don't know sounds very reasonable. You had the Milah, you had the circumcision, you did not have the Tefillah as of yet. According to the Gemara in Yevamos, you're not Jewish. The Gemara in Sanhedrin is pretty clear that a non-Jew is not allowed to observe Shabbos. That's also the Psak, the Rambam paskins that way. And so therefore 2 + 2 = 4. This command that came from the Bezdin that this guy had to write words on Shabbos sounds actually pretty reasonable. But Rabbi Yosef Schwartz, the one who's writing this tshuva in Divrei Yosef, he disagrees. And he's writing this tshuva because he disagrees. And let's see what he has to say in number 4. Mayachar shekvar nimoil, in his opinion, once the bris happens, af shaloi taval, even without immersion, then le'inyan Shabbos hu ki Yisrael. When it comes for the din of Shabbos, you're counted as a Jew. Va'av shalish are dinim einenu ki Yisrael ad shetaval. True that for all other matters of Jewish law, the person isn't considered Jewish, and there are so many nafkaminas, there are so many differences between if someone has the status of a Jew or a Gentile that we don't need to enumerate them right now. So the Gemara in Yevamos, that's as a general rule. But we have an exception to the rule. What's the exception to the rule? Le'inyan Shabbos. Why? Why is Shabbos different? There are 2 mitzvahs that have the word bris and ois associated with both of these mitzvahs. One of them is mitzvahs Milah, which is this week's parsha, Parshas Lech Lecha, where it says toward the end of the parsha, V'haya la'ois bris beini uveinechem, that it's la'ois, it's a sign, bris, it's a covenant. Hashem says that the bris Milah is a sign and a covenant between him and the Jewish people. And then in Parshas Kisisa, when it speaks about Shabbos, and it says, Hashem v'nei Yisrael sa Shabbos, Lases as Shabbos l'doiroisam bris oilam, bris, beini uvein b'nei Yisrael, oisi la'oilam. And so you have the word bris and ois by these two. Therefore, because you had the bris, you have the ois and the bris. Number 1, which is Milah, so then mitzvah, v'chiyuv, olav, l'kayin, ganke, mitzvah, Shabbos, so then you have to do Shabbos. Shabbos is an exception because it's so uniquely tied together with bris Milah that we use the same word for both, and so therefore Rabbi Yosef says that he thinks that this is the exception and this guy should have actually kept Shabbos. But he also knows that that's not enough. It's a svara, but it's not, you need a source, right? If you want to make a psak, then you kind of need a source. And so he turns to the Medrash. The Medrash that he turns to is Dvarim Rabbah that says the following passage. V'amar Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina, the following teaching. Ovid kechavam, again, probably originally Goy. Sheshamar es HaShabbos, a non-Jew who observed the Shabbos, ad shaloi kibel olav es hamila, before he accepted Milah, chayev misa, is liable to receive the death penalty. This is the same teaching that we had in the Gemara, but seemingly with a qualification. It doesn't say, in the Gemara just said, Goysha Shavas Chayev Misa. Here we have a Goysha Shavas, before accepting Milah is Chayev Misa, which the immediate implication being that a Goy who accepted Milah, maybe even before he did the Milah, just accepting. But let's not get into that. Let's just say, certainly if you did the Milah, then this rule doesn't apply to you. That's what the Dvarim Rabbah sounds like. The Lama, but why is a regular Gentile who didn't accept Milah, why is he Chayev Misa? So the reason given here in the Medrash is Shaloi Nitztavu Aleh, because it's not their mitzvah. Now what does that mean? It's not their mitzvah, that's a reason that you're not allowed to do it? That doesn't really make so much sense. So the Medrash explains more. Amar Rab Chia bar Abba, Amar Rab Yochanan, Rab Chia taught in the name of Rab Yochanan. B'noyek Shabbat, let me tell you how it works in the real world. Melech o matroina yoshvin o masichin zeh zeh. If you have a king and queen sitting and conversing with each other, and someone comes and invades the conversation and says, I have something to share here too. So what's going to happen? He's going to be executed. Ain't it chayev misa? Is this person not chayev misa? King and queen are talking, who are you to mix in? Kacha Shabbos hazu ben Yisrael ve'en HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So too Shabbos is the conversation. Shabbos is a conversation we and Hashem are having every single week. Shenemar beini uvein b'nei Yisrael. It's between the two of us, between Hashem and us. Lefichach, therefore, when you come and you're butting into the conversation, before the bris, chayav misa is chayav misa. So what you see over here, it's interesting. It's actually a different svara, a different logic than the Gemara. The Gemara's logic was, we want productivity, we want people to move and to get things done. Lo yish boisu. Here it's more like there's this unique moment that the Cresson and Kala are having, and no one else belongs there. So the guy doesn't belong there. That's the and we'll talk more about the difference later on. But for right now, Rabbi Yosef Schwartz feels really good about this raya. He has, yes, it is true, a non-Jew is not allowed to keep Shabbos, absolutely, but till when? Ad shaloi kibel olav es hamila. Once circumcision was done, now the person is allowed to keep Shabbos. And so therefore this ger in 1848 in Chodesh Adar in Yerushalayim was absolutely allowed to keep Shabbos. And so Rabbi Yosef joins all of the voices that were upset. He joins all those voices. He himself is not from, we saw that the Sfardim wanted to do the Nazifa. But he also said that he implied that all the Talmidei Chachamim were upset, and he is amongst them as an Ashkenazi rabbi. He's not too thrilled with this psak din. Okay, now, in order for us to really understand what's happening here and what's going on over here, because I asked before the question of why would a Rav give a psak unilaterally on his own. So we're going to get the answer to this from Rabbi Yechiel Michal Tukatsinski. Rabbi Yechiel Michal Tukatsinski, a very important posek in the first half of the 20th century, paskin on many issues, lives in Yerushalayim. He married the granddaughter of a very important rabbi. The important rabbi was Reb Shmuel Salant. Reb Shmuel Salant was the chief, was the Av Bezdin for the Kehila of the Ashkenazim at this time. And Rabbi Yechiel Michal Tukatsinski, writing long after the story in 1905, but he writes about the impressions that he has of this story. And he says as follows: Chami Skeni, my wife's grandfather, Rabbeinu Shmuel Salant, who again was the Av Bezdin for the Ashkenazi community in 1848, Loi Hoya Oz B'Yerushalayim. He wasn't in town during this whole story. Why? Because he traveled for a few weeks. A few weeks prior, he traveled to Russia to deal with the Koilalim, that's all the people who were living off the tzedakah and they were supposed to be learning Torah in Eretz Yisrael. Tzarchei Kehila, regular community stuff. Some yeshiva he was working on, a Talmud Torah that he was involved in. And so the rabbi left. So who took his place? Who took the place of the Rav Av Bezdin? So he says, Rav Godel v'tzadik echad meha rabbanim me'abeis din tzedek shalagoyin Reb Shmuel Salant. One of the rabbanim, he calls him a tzaddik, who was on the Bezdin of Reb Shmuel Salant. He's the one who took over. And the question came to this Rav. Now remember, this Rav views himself as he is filling the shoes of the Av Bezdin. In other words, he is the Av Bezdin. The Av Bezdin has the right definitely to make a unilateral psak, which is what he did. You could also understand that all the other Rabbanim are like, you're no Reb Shmuel Salant. We have the right to kind of question you. I mean, maybe they would even question Reb Shmuel Salant, but how much more so would they question someone who's just a fill-in? And so that's why this happens. He goes ahead unilaterally because I'm filling in for the Av Bezdin. I need to live up to the office and to the position. The other people are all upset. They're like, who are you? Okay. Now the story continues. Rabbi Yechiel Michal Tukatsinski continues explaining again in 1905 in Hama'asef. Hama'asef is a journal, a rabbinic journal that came out of Yerushalayim, and this is where he wrote this article about this case. And he says that when this Dayan Tzedek saw that everyone's waging war on him and he felt isolated, he wrote 2 letters. Rabbi Tukatsinski tells us he wrote 2 letters. One, he wrote to Reb Shmuel Salant, the Av Bezdin. Now the Av Bezdin was then in Russia. So he sent to him a letter. And in fact, he says over here that he was in Varsha. So he sends a letter to Warsaw. He also sends a letter to another one of the great Rabbanim in Europe at the time, who's known as Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger was the rabbi of Altena. Today, Altena is in Hamburg. And he wrote the Sefer Aruch L'Ner, and his response to his Chuvas is Binyan Sion. So he sent a letter to both of these two Rabbanim, and he justified his position why he thinks that the guy wasn't allowed to keep Shabbos. So let's go to the Chuvas of Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, because Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger actually, in addition to answering, also reproduced the question. So now, let us hear the question in the voice of the rabbi who forced this guy to be Mechalel Shabbos. So Shalos HaTshuvas Binyan Tzion, Simin, Tzaddik Aleph. Baruch Hashem, Altena. Remember, this is Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger writing. Yoim Vav Chavav Iyar Tafresh Tes. So this is Iyar Tafresh Tes. This is more than a year after the story happened. The story happened in Adar Tafresh Ches. This is Iyar Tafresh Tes. And he's writing, and he gives us the name of the person he's writing to. Thank God, now we know who this rabbi is. La Rav Agoin, Asher Lemel. Asher Lemel, who is the Goyin Av Bezdin, the Kilas Kodesh Galin. So Galin is a city in Poland, it's northern Poland. Today it's actually close to the border with Russia, the area of Kaliningrad. So he was there over there, and then, like many Rabbanim during this day, they get a little older, they moved to Eretz Yisrael. So he came to Eretz Yisrael in 1845. He passed away 5 years later. So this story, 1848, is, it's a small 5-year stint that he's in Eretz Yisrael. And Ucheis, Mishkan Kvoide is Yerushalayim. Now, in 1849, he's in Yerushalayim. So Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger writes as follows: Kasav Malas Kvoid Teirasai v'Zelashayne. This is what you wrote. So from now on, we're actually reading Rabbi Asher Lemel's writing. What does Rabbi Asher Lemel say? Yelamdeinu Rabbeinu, teach us. But Uvda da Asalidan, we had a story that happened here. Po Yira Kodesh Yerushalayim Yom Gimel, Tuesday. Remember, the other one also told us it was a Tuesday. But here he gives us the date. Chav Gimel Liyerach Adar Sheni, the 23rd of Adar Sheni. The other one just told us it's in Adar. Here we get more specific information. It happened on Chav Gimel Adar Sheni Shnas Tafresh Ches in the year 1848. Ha'avar Leprat Katan. What's the story? Nima Leine Yehudi Echad Shabah Hine Medinas Morocco. There was a non-Jew who converted, who came from Morocco, and he converted l'shem Geirus Bifanenu. Now immediately there's a problem over here. If a person has a bris already, then when they convert, then they're just going to have a tafas dam. They're not going to need a full circumcision. If a person is a Gentile from Morocco, so then presumably they would have been circumcised already, so they wouldn't have needed a full bris. So this is something bizarre. We're going to come back to this later on. But for right now, we're going to stick with this Morocco identification. And he came to our Bezdin, the Ashkenazim. All right, so you can convert with the Sephardim, you can convert with the Ashkenazim. This person chose to convert with the Ashkenazim, which makes sense because it was the Ashkenazi rabbi who said on Shabbos that he has to be Mechalel Shabbos. Okay, Uvi Shabbos Kodesh Halacharav, and the Shabbos after, Adayin Loya Nisrapa Mimilasa, he didn't recover from his bris. And that's why Loy Tavala Oidnan. That's why he didn't immerse in the mikveh. Okay, that's useful information. Why Taka did he not immerse by Shabbos? The din is you need to wait till you fully recover from the circumcision, and that doesn't always happen immediately. And so that's why he couldn't toivel from Tuesday to Sunday. He couldn't to Shabbos. He couldn't toivel. Now he continues. Reb Asher Lemel saying his side of the story. He gidu li lemar. People told me. Doesn't say who, but people told me. Mizri zasai b'mitzvahs. They wanted to talk about this ger, and how special he was, and how particular he was about mitzvahs. You can imagine, Gerus didn't happen every day, and so everyone in Yerushalayim was talking about this. And so they were telling me about it. And they said, he's very careful about Shabbos. Hagam, even though he's sick, he just had a bris. So he's ill. He's a chayla she'ein by sakana. Which, if you're a chayla she'ein by sakana, you have a right to tell a Gentile to do malachas. Nonetheless, this guy, he's not asking any Gentile to do any malacha for him. He doesn't want it. He's keeping Shabbos 100%. Look how much he cares about his Yiddishkeit. That's what they were telling him. V'yishafti lahem, and I answered, l'daiti, my opinion. Not only is permitted for him to do malacha, he must do malacha because of the din is yom v'layla lo yishpaisu. The Gemara says, that's the pasuk, that's the source text that the Gemara uses, that a Gentile is not allowed to observe Shabbos. And he's chayiv lasis malacha b'Shabbos calls man shaloi tavel l'shen geres because he didn't immerse yet. Now, what's interesting here is you actually get information here that's different from what Rabbi Yechiel Michal Tukatzinski. Rabbi Yechiel Michal Tukatzinski made it sound like there was a shaila that came up. Someone asked a shaila and they came to the Rav. There was no shaila. There was no shaila. They were sitting around the table, Shabbos afternoon, there was a shmooze. And someone mentioned it. And someone said, by the way, look, he's such a Shomer Shabbos, look how amazing it is. And that's when he said, but by the way, he shouldn't be a Shomer Shabbos. There was no question that was asked. It's a little bit of a funny time to ask a question. Okay, let's continue. He says, the people who listened to me, they went to this convert, and they said in my name, Reb Asher Lemel's name. When was this? Shabbos kodesh la'achar tfilas mincha. It was Shabbos after mincha. So it's even worse in a sense because the guy kept the whole Friday night. He kept the whole Friday morning. He's like all the way at the end. It's like the person, and I know such a person who like fainted 10 minutes before the fast is over. It's like a little bit of a waste, right? So that's what's happening over here. Shabbos kodesh la'achar tfilas mincha. V'chein asa. And that's what he did. He wrote a few letters. Okay. Now, I once spoke about this before, and I want to mention this again now. When people write their questions, their biases are baked into the way they write their questions. Does he mention over here that the guy said, Vayemoin, I don't want to write. I always kept Shabbos. I shouldn't have to write. No Vayemoin. Does he write over here the guy cried? No, he doesn't write that the guy cried. Why? Because he wants the guy to write. He thinks it's the right thing. So he has a reason, subconscious. He has a reason not to elaborate on those details that the guy didn't want to, and he went kicking and screaming and he was crying. On the other hand, Reb Yosef Schwartz, he didn't want the guy to write. He felt it was wrong. So for him, it pays to actually spend the ink and the time and the effort to elaborate on how he went kicking and screaming. It's something really important to think about how questions are asked, and really so much more can be said about that, but it's sufficient for right now. The next day, everyone was yelling at me. The Sfardim, he mentions them first. Remember, they wanted to do in the Zifa. And the Ashkenazim, everyone's upset at me. And one of the things they said is, Hema zoichrim, kama geinim shenimoilu poi ira koidesh, v'loi nishma kazai. Say, remember, there were some Geidim. In other words, Geidim was not happening every day in 1848. They couldn't say, what about last week? What about the guy a month ago? And what about the guy last year? No, it's like they remember the 10 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago. It wasn't very common. So they said they never heard of such a thing. They never heard of such a thing that the first Shabbos after the bris, before the immersion, that the person has to be mechalel Shabbos. Va'amina taima didi. So I want to tell you my reasoning. Really, I should have consulted with the other Rabbanim that were here. It was too late in the day. Shabbos is over in 45 minutes. Shabbos is over in an hour. It's Leis Erev, so I had no choice. And remember what I said before. And I'm the Av Bezdin. I'm the Av Bezdin, so it's my achrayus. The halacha that happens in the city is my achrayus. So I'm going to start consulting right now. It's too late in the day. I just found out about this literally a few minutes ago. And the din is pretty obvious. Remember the two principles that we said before. The Gemara is pretty clear that before immersion, you're not Jewish. Gemara is clear, a Gentile can't keep Shabbos. And so I didn't really think this is very controversial. And so that was my psak. Now, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger is summarizing what Reb Asher Lemel wrote to him. However, he cuts off over here. And he doesn't give us more of the tshuva. He just says, and you wrote a lot more justifying your position, and here, let me tell you what I think. And we'll see what Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger thinks in a second. But the problem with that is, we need to have this information. We need to know what Rabbi Asher Lemel thinks. There are no tshuvas from Rabbi Asher Lemel. There are nothing that survived. There's no books or anything like that. So we need to know his position. Well, there's one other place where we can find more information about what his position was justifying this. And that is as follows. Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, I mentioned before, he was a rabbi in Altena. And he was responsible for overseeing, as the editor, for a rabbinic journal is not the right word, because it was literally 4 or 5 pages that came out. It was a bi-weekly. It was appended to some other newspaper. And it was like Torah stuff, written all in Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, Halacha. And he was the editor of this. It was called Shomer Tzion HaNeman, and it came out for about 10 years. So, a few years later, remember, this story is in 48. he gets his letter and he's responding to Reb Asher Lemel in 1849, a year later. So it's 3 years later, in 1853, by this time Reb Asher Lemel already passed away, he decided, you know what, I'm going to put this into the newspaper, into Shomer Tzion HaNeman. And what he did is, he gave us there much more, not all, but much more of what Reb Asher Lemel said. And so if a person wants to study Reb Asher Lemel's thing, you got to go there. You have to go to Shomer Tzion HaNeman to see much more of the material. Now, when we read that, we're not going to do everything, obviously. We're only looking at a few points of this fascinating topic. One of the things Reb Asher Lemel does is he contends with the Medrash. Remember before we had the Medrash said, very clear Medrash, a Gentile is not allowed to keep Shabbos before bris. After bris, it's okay. He quotes from a tshuva from Yecheskel Landau, one of the great poskim in the 18th century, from Noida Yehuda. Madura Tinyana, Yeridea Kuf Samach Aleph. This is the same tshuva, if you remember the tshuva from the Noida Yehuda about Esther and the adultery to save lives, it's the same tshuva. Anyway, Rabbi Cheskel Landau writes, he quotes a Yerushalmi, the Noida Yehuda quotes a Yerushalmi that says, Ein lemeidin lo min halaches, lo min agades, lo min ateseftes, ela min Gemara. You're not allowed to learn halacha just from any place you want. You're not allowed to learn from the Agadita. You're not allowed to learn from a Tosefta. Even from a Mishnah or halachas, you're not supposed to be learning. You have to paskin. You paskin from the Gemara. Now, whoever is writing to Rabbi Cheskel Landau says, oh, look, the Yerushalmi lumps together two things, Tosefta and Agadita. Now, why is that important? Because we have a rule in Poskim that say that, yeah, you don't paskin off a Tosefta. But if the Tosefta doesn't contradict the Talmud Bavli, then you do paskin like the Tosefta. That's not controversial. So says this unnamed individual to Rabbi Cheskel Landau, same thing for Medrash. Because remember, the Yerushalmi lumps Medrash together with the Tosefta. If that's true for the Tosefta, let it be true for the Medrash as well. Namely, that if there's a Medrash that doesn't contradict the Gemara, then we paskin like the Medrash. Says Rabbi Cheskel Landau, absolutely not. There's a big difference. Why? Tosefta is halacha. So therefore, because the object is halacha, so when it doesn't contradict Bavli, I could say paskin like it. Medrash, the purpose is not halacha at all. It's from a different genre. He says the purpose is musar, remazim, mishalin. He says it's ikar hadas. This is fundamental to Judaism, but it's not halachic work, and therefore I don't want it to be brought ein lameidim lahen lepsak halacha klal. Don't bring it at all. Says Reb Asher Lemel, that pertains over here. Don't bring me a medrash and say we're going to paskin off a medrash. Medrash is outside the corpus of how you paskin halacha. It's a non-factor. But then he goes further, Reb Asher Lemel, and he says, in fact, everyone would agree that if the medrash contradicts the Gemara, you're not going to follow the Gemara, right? Excuse me, you're not going to follow the medrash, right? In this case, it actually contradicts. This medrash actually contradicts the Gemara. Why is that? Because, first of all, let's think about the logic. There, in the Gemara, what did it say? It said, Lo yush boisu. We need people to be productive. The Medrash gave a whole different reason. Its reason is that there's an intimate conversation between God and the Jewish people, and what do they have to do with it? And moreover, there's a real nafkamina between the two. What happens if a Gentile wants to keep Shabbos on a Monday, Tuesday, or a Wednesday? According to the Gemara's reason, it's a problem. You need to be productive. According to the Medrash's reason, who cares? You're not butting into our conversation. We're not having any conversation today. And so it's a real difference between the Medrash, both in philosophy, as well there is an afkamina ledin, and so therefore it actually contradicts the Gemara. It contradicts the Gemara. Take this Medrash and throw it out. I'm not interested in paskening. This is based on this Medrash. This is some of Reb Asher Lemel's tainis. Again, he has a very, very long tshuva. All of it doesn't exist. A lot of it exists in Shomer Tzion HaNeman, and a teeny bit of it exists in the tshuva of the binyan scene. Okay, so he sent two letters. One to Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. This is what Tukaczynski told us, right? Rabbi Yechiel Michal Tukaczynski said he sent two letters. One to Rabbi Shmuel Salanter, who was in Warsaw, and one to Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. So what were the answers of these Rabbanim? A lot depends on what these two Rabbanim are going to say. Rabbi Shmuel Salanter answered with a very short letter that is printed in a relatively new sefer, Toras Reb Shmuel Salant, volume 1, where he has a very short letter to Reb Asher Lemel, and he quotes a Rashba. The Rashba is dealing with a Gemara in Yevamis, Daf Ayin Aleph, Amid Aleph, that's dealing with the following problem. When it comes to Parshas Bayin, it's speaking about the Korban Pesach. It says, Toishav Esachir, someone who's a resident. He's not part of the Jewish people, but he's a toishav or a sachir. He's a hired hand. He's not part of the Jewish people. He's here for labor. Lo yochal bo is not allowed to eat the korban pesach. The Gemara's problem is that's obvious. We know that an oral is not allowed to eat a korban pesach. So why do we need to specify and talk about a toishav, someone who comes to live here, or a sachir, a hired hand? If these people are arelim, they aren't Jewish, so then obviously they're not allowed to eat the korban pesach. And so the Gemara, in order to deal with this problem, comes up with the following solution: that this pasuk toishav is sachir lo yochal boy, which it says in Parshas Boy, is la'asuya, is coming to teach us about a very unique case. It's talking about a ger, Shemal, who had his bris, the loy taval, but didn't immerse yet. And you would say, well, he started the process, so maybe he could eat the korban pesach. He's not like a regular Gentile. He had his bris already. He's not an oral, in fact. So maybe he can eat the korban pesach. Says the Gemara, absolutely, that's what the pasuk is telling us. Absolutely not. He's not allowed to eat the korban pesach. So the Rashba has a question. The question of the Rashba is, I don't understand. If you had a milah but no tefillah, we know from the Gemara that you're not Jewish. So why do I need a pasuk to tell me this? Remember, the whole reason we're having this conversation is like, why do I need this pasuk? It's extra. So you came up with this case. This case is also extra. I know that someone who had milah, no tefillah, is not Jewish. Kashali, in kain hainu goy, it's a regular din of a goy. So what's the answer? So he continues, says, Valesa. No. We actually need this pasuk to tell us about this case. This is someone who he's not stam circumcised. He actually circumcised as part of the conversion process to become a Jew. And though he didn't finish the process, he started. He a little became involved in Judaism. And why? He only has one more step. So I would have really thought that he's different than a regular guy. And so therefore I would have thought that he's allowed to eat the korban pesach. And so therefore I needed a pasuk to tell me that he's not allowed to eat the korban pesach. So is he allowed to eat the korban pesach? No. But says Reb Shmuel Salant, I needed the Gemara to tell me that. And I had a pasuk to tell me that. Which means, when I don't have a pasuk, for the korban pesach I needed a pasuk to tell me, this unique case, he can't eat the korban pesach. Okay, I only have it for korban pesach. I don't have that for Shabbos. And so therefore for Shabbos, you would leave it by the opposite. And that is, that he should be allowed to keep Shabbos. And you would say, well, maybe you should derive from korban pesach and say, just like by korban pesach, so too Shabbos? No. We have a rule we don't learn from kachim. Kachim is really strict. Karbanis is really strict. And just because something is a certain way by kachim doesn't necessarily translate to Shabbos. So yes, the Torah, a pasuk in the Torah, and the Gemara went out of its way to show us that this unique category can't bring korban pesach. Okay, but only the korban pesach. Shabbos? No. He's allowed to observe Shabbos. Reb Shmuel Salant goes on in his letter to say, in fact, if you make this guy be mechalel Shabbos, you have a problem. Why? Because he's in the middle of the conversion process, and all of a sudden he's doing an aveira right now. So maybe he had charata on his Kabbalah Samitzvahs. And if he had charat on his Kabbalah Samitzvahs, then he has to redo Kabbalah Samitzvahs, and maybe even he's going to have to do a tafas dam bris again to start the process all over again. Now, I don't think Reb Shmuel Salant meant it in this case, because in this case, the person was forced to do it. So no one in their right mind would say that he's having charata. In fact, he was crying. So I don't think he meant it in this case, but I think he meant it as a general principle, and to really tell Rabbi Shalomel that no, I don't think this was a good idea. Now that was Reb Shmuel Salant's response. Let's go now back to Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger also gave a tshuva. And this is, as we said before, Binyan Tzion, Siman Sadik Aleph. He says as follows. I investigated other places that accept Geir. I'm not clear on whether Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger himself and his bezin, whether they did Geirus or not. Geirus was very specific. In some places, you weren't allowed to do it by law, and so not every beis din was involved in Geirus. I don't know what was going on in Altena. But he says he spoke to other batei din that does Geirus. The Nemarli and I was told, Shagam Shah Me'oilon Lo Yikpidu, that no one ever cared about this. Shalo Yishmar Ager Shabbos Kodemat Tefillah. They let the ger do what he needed to do, what he wanted to do. They let him keep Shabbos. They never told him that he has to break Shabbos. And so now, v'nasati alibi lim saitamlas, I try to understand the logic of this. Acharei shalachoira psak malas kvoi tarasoi musad al adnei adin v'emes. On the one hand, you have a compelling case because of the two principles we said before. You're not Jewish, A, and B, a non-Jew is not allowed to keep Shabbos. But the custom is not that way. And once I establish that the custom is not that way, and remember, they said in Yerushalayim also the custom was not that way. So once the custom is not that way, I want to come up with a logic. So here is what the logic is, he says. He says, Milas Hager is called a bris. And we make the bracha, koides habris, for this milah, as we say in Gemara Shabbos. Shabbos also is called a bris. And so therefore it's very weird. Eich neimar, that achas shenichnas lebris, ha'achas yemuchrach lafer bris hacheres. It is very bizarre that he did one bris, the bris milah, and that he's being forced to violate the other bris. Very similar to what Rabbi Yosef Schwartz said that we saw before. Rabbi Yosef Schwartz also mentioned the ois, but it's a similar idea. This is a bris, this is a bris. Very bizarre that you would have to break the Shabbos in order in this scenario. Then he goes further and adds another argument. The argument, he says, is that the Jewish people were commanded to keep Shabbos when? In Mara. In Mara. That's after they left Mitzrayim, before Matan Torah. They were all circumcised by then, because to eat the Karban Pesach, they all had to be circumcised, and the pasuk is pretty clear in Sefer Yeshua. The Jews left Egypt, they already had their milah. So that's fine. But did they have tevilah? Did they have immersion? The answer is no, they did not have immersion. The Gemara says that immersion only happened later in the process, where the Psukim and Parashas Mishpatim talk about Moshe sprinkling the dam on the Jewish people, and sprinkling of the dam is hazah. Hazah always needs to be coupled together with tefillah. So that's when the story at the end of Parashas Mishpatim, that's when tefillah happened. There's different shittas when it is. It's right before Matan Torah, it's a little after Matan Torah. Doesn't matter. The point is, when the Jews were keeping Shabbos in Mara, they had milah, they didn't have tefillah. And so therefore you have precedent for this, that maybe you don't need to be a complete convert, maybe you don't need to be a complete Jew, even if you only did the milah without having the tefillah, you should be able to keep Shabbos. This is how Rabbi Ettlinger says his, concludes v'lechein. He concludes his tshuva. Lefi ani daiti, in my opinion, yofe noagu. Shaloi lakuf leger, shamal v'loi taval lasas malacha b'Shabbos. It is a proper custom and a good custom not to force the ger to do malacha on Shabbos. Kain nir lefi ani daiti yakotan Yaakov, and he signs off with his name. In the newspaper, the Shomer Tzion Haneman, after producing the tshuva of Reb Asher Lemel, meaning the letter of Reb Asher Lemel, which by the way, it took 3 months because it was serialized. So it took 3 months for the whole tshuva, for the whole letter of Reb Asher Lemel to be produced, and then he gave a version of his tshuva. It's not word for word, but it's very close to what he responded in his tshuva he put in over there. Let's go back to Rabbi Yosef Schwartz. Rabbi Yosef Schwartz in the Divrei Yosef tells us what the end of the story was. He says, initially, all of the proofs that we brought Reb Asher Lemel, dacha bebeis yadav, he didn't accept. But be'ezer akel, ani satarti dvarav, I completed the job by really refuting what he said, and he couldn't really respond to what I had to say, and he reluctantly agreed that indeed he did something that was wrong. I take this with a major grain of salt. I don't believe that it was Rabbi Yosef Schwartz's arguments that caused Reb Asher Lemel to say that he was wrong. That comes from reading his arguments, as well as if you look at the general story. He sent the letter to 2 great Rabbanim, Reb Shmuel Salanter and the Binyan Tzion, Reb Yaakov Ettlinger, and when he basically realized that both of them were on the side with everyone else, he essentially had no support, so then he realized that he wasn't correct. And so that's pretty much how this story in this tkufa and this time. I'll add one more thing, and that is we saw before that Rabbi Shmuel Salant was in Warsaw at the time that he received this letter. So Rabbi Tukaczynski writes in that same article in 1905 that he understood that Rabbi Salant turned to the Ger Rebbe, Chidushei Arim, Rabbi Yitzchak Meir of Ger. And he was a famous posek. He was staying in his house in Warsaw, and he asked him, what do you think about this? And he said, no, he also agrees. The guy could keep Shabbos. And what's interesting is that the Chidushei Arim in Maseches Yevamis, when he's discussing these related matter, he actually goes out of his way to say that specifically and to say it clearly. And in that way, it was pretty much the consensus. In subsequent decades, many Rabbanim spoke about this. Many Rabbanim spoke. But in terms of the first iteration of this, is in 1848, in this tkufa. These are the names of the people that were involved. And what's also interesting is there isn't much of a discussion about this before. Try to find a discussion about this, and you're not going to find much. I didn't find anything. I'm not saying there is nothing, but I didn't find anything before. So this is the first iteration of this conversation in 1848, 1849, and then in subsequent decades, many more Rabbanim spoke about it. Now leaves us with the following question: is there a way of figuring out who this Gentile was, who this Ger Tzedek was? Okay. We're looking here at a newspaper clipping from 1854. This is a newspaper that comes out of the city of New York. It's a Jewish newspaper. It's known as the Asmonean, otherwise like the Chashmonoi. This is a paper that came out of New York between the 1840s, the 1850s. This is before the Civil War in the United States. And we have over here a correspondence from someone named Robert Leon, who is in Alexandria, Egypt, and he's writing an article about his experience February 2nd, 1854. And he says as follows: he's, "My dear sir," or actually, let me take that back. The writer is not Robert Leon. He's writing to Robert Leon, and the letter to Robert Leon gets published in the newspaper. Okay. "My dear sir, having promised the people at Jerusalem and Hebron to write home and acquaint you with their present condition, I promised the Yidden in Yerushalayim and Hebron that I'm going to tell you, Mr. Leon, about their situation. So I hasten to redeem the same, which I hope you will lay before your readers. Palestine at this time," and here he gives his report, "contains the small..." Okay, and he goes on to give a report. We're jumping now to the following paragraph. "The smallpox has also been raging at Jerusalem since the middle of December. Smallpox is a terrible disease, which has already decimated the whole population and has not abated when we left on the 17th of January, and were particularly in the Jewish quarter." So the Jews have a more severe situation of smallpox. "The day previous to my departure, I called to take leave of Warder Cresson, Esquire of Philadelphia. I went to visit a man by the name of Warder Cresson from Philadelphia, whom I met a few days previous on horseback at the tomb of Rachel." So he meets this Warder Cresson of Philadelphia at Cave of Rachel, and now he's leaving, so he goes to talk to him. "On approaching him and taking him by the hand, I found him covered with that foul disease." So Warder Cresson has smallpox. "Something should be done for him if he recovers," and that's like in italics, because it's like a big if this guy is going to recover, as he is in a straitened circumstance, in fact, penniless. So this Mr. Warder Cresson is penniless, so something should be done to help him, but that's if he survives, because he has the terrible disease of smallpox. Now, what's interesting about this, he doesn't stop to tell you anything about who Warder Cresson is, or why it's important, or why this Jew who's receiving this letter, or the readers, are going to be interested in helping this man, Warder Cresson. It's almost like everyone knows who Warder Cresson is at this time. So who is Warder Cresson? In 1844, 2 books are published, both out of London, by a man named Warder Cresson. Under his name, it says United States Consul at Jerusalem. So that's like he opened what we'll call, for our purposes, an embassy for the United States government in Jerusalem. The first book is called The Good Olive Tree, Israel. The second is called Jerusalem, the Center and Joy of the Whole Earth. But if you read these title pages closer, you'll see that clearly he's a Christian. For example, on the left-hand side, he's bringing from the Christian Bible a passage. But at the same time, he's writing very positively about Jews, as we'll see on these title pages. So, The Good Olive Tree, Israel, showing the preeminence and ascendancy of Israel in the coming dispensation. That means in the coming Yeshua, in the coming Geula that's going to happen above all nations of the earth. All right, and Jerusalem, the center joy of the whole world, and the Jew, the recipient of the glory of God. So you clearly see over here who is someone who respects Jews, who's enamored by Jews. He's calling himself the United States Consul at Jerusalem, so he's in touch with Yidden, and he's seeing Jews. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, and I didn't see any of these documents myself, but according to what I've seen online, He was appointed to be the United States consul at Jerusalem, but that was revoked very soon thereafter when basically someone sent a letter to the Secretary of State saying this is a terrible idea, he's not fit for the job, etc., etc. And so it was revoked. But for at least a while after, he still considered himself to be the United States consul at Jerusalem. And anyway, he went for free. He was doing this pro bono, so it's not like, it's not like the withholding of funds mattered for this individual. Here's a picture of Warder Cresson around the time that we're talking about, from the year 1840. Let's fast forward now to the year 1845. We have an article in The Occident. The Occident is a newspaper that is put out by a man named Isaac Leeser. Isaac Leeser is a very important person in Philadelphia, and in fact for American Jewry at this time, because he's combating reform. He's like, no, it's orthodoxy. He comes from Germany, so his style is similar in certain ways to Samson Raphael Hirsch. He lives in Philadelphia. He puts out a newspaper that's called The Occident, and he writes, as this is dated June 1845. He writes as follows. We have been shown a private letter from Mr. Warder Cresson. That's the same individual. We've seen a letter from Mr. Cresson, U.S. Consul at the Holy Cities. He's calling him the U.S. Consul. Dated at the beginning of March, in which Mr. Cresson gives a very melancholy picture of the destitution of the Israelites in the seat of their ancient glory. So basically, Jews in Yerushalayim are not doing too well. And avers, and he states, he's swearing essentially, that the conversions which have been reported as having taken place under the patronage of the Protestant Episcopal Mission were owing to the wants of the converts, not to their conviction. He's referring here to the fact that during this time, it seems that a few Yidden in Yerushalayim did the unthinkable and converted to Christianity. So Warder Cresson is writing, don't worry, worry, but it's not like they were convinced that Christianity is the right religion. The Matzav Gashmi, the physical reality, is so bad in Yerushalayim. People have no food, and this just pushed a few people over the edge. This is a curious testimony from an ardent Christian. It's coming from a Christian. Warder Cresson is a Christian. And so it's interesting that he's writing this. In other words, you're able to see Cresson doesn't like the missionary activity that's going on in Yerushalayim. He's uncomfortable with it. He thinks it's not fair. He thinks it's taking advantage of people. And then Isaac Leeser continues writing, can nothing be done to relieve so much suffering? What can we do? And he goes on to say what Cresson suggests a system of collection. So Cresson is actually concerned about the Jewish community and comes up with an idea. And that's what I want to show you over here, what Warder Cresson is in 1845. Let's fast forward 4 years to 1849, same newspaper, The Occident. You have an article here. Look at the signature on the bottom right, signed by Warder Cresson, the same individual. But look here at the article. It starts, Reasons for Becoming a Jew. Reasons for Becoming a Jew. Warder Cresson was writing an article in The Occident in 1849. He's the one who we know was in Yerushalayim as the consul, 1844, 1845. Clearly a Christian then. Now he says Reasons for Becoming a Jew. And you'll see what he does. On the left-hand side, he makes a list of words associated with Christianity. On the right-hand side, he makes a list of the words associated with Judaism. So, New Testament versus Old, Gospel versus Law, Trinity versus Unity, 3 versus 1, divisibility versus indivisibility, Roman Sunday, the Sabbath, uncircumcision, circumcision, and on he goes. And then he writes as follows, I had the misfortune, without any power or control of my own, to prevent it, to be born and educated in the first form and column of error and contradiction. So it's not my fault. I was born on the left-hand side column. And now I have my reason and understanding were then ever at war and opposition with the second form and column of truth. I was always combating the second column, which all enlightened Jews, and he goes on to say Turks and Christians as well, say is truth. True. I have therefore embraced it and my mind is at rest. So basically, that's why I'm converting. Fast forward to 1852. This Warder Cresson is back in America. He was already back in 1849 when he published that article in the Occident. In 1852, he publishes a book in Philadelphia. And in fact, on the title page, he gives only the Hebrew year. If you see, it says 5612. That's the year 1852. The book is titled The Key of David, David, the True Messiah, or the Anointed of the God of Jacob, and more material, by Warder Cresson. He writes it. In the introduction, he writes as follows. In the spring of 1844, I left everything near and dear to me on earth. I left my wife of my youth and 6 lovely children and an excellent farm with everything comfortable around me. I left all these in the pursuit of truth and for the sake of the truth alone. So he's referring here to his travel to Yerushalayim in 1844, when we know he was still a Christian, as we're able to see in 1844, 1845. But here he's saying that when he went in 1844, he was looking for the truth, and he was in the process of leaving everything. In page 204 in this book, he writes as follows. I've already stated in my introduction at the commencement of this work that in the spring of 1844, I left everything near and dear to me on earth and went to Jerusalem. Okay, now let's continue reading. He writes as follows. I remained in Jerusalem and my former faith until the 28th day of March, 1848. So I remained a Christian until the 28th day of March, 1848, when I became fully satisfied that I could never obtain strength and rest but by doing as Ruth did, and as saying to her mother-in-law, and now he quotes the pasuk that Ruth said to Naomi, entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee, right? I don't want to leave, don't tell me to leave you, my people are your people, and all of that. So he quotes the whole passage from Ruth over here, 5-6 lines. In short, upon the 28th day of March, 1848, I was circumcised, entered the Holy Covenant, and became a Jew. And as the above words prove, that Ruth became a Jew. Okay, God, let's continue. Soon after my return home to my family, which I did upon the 20th of September, 1848. So that's really important. Where is his conversion? His conversion happens in Yerushalayim. He returns after his conversion, the 28th of September, 1848, later that year. I found that there was growing opposition and enmity toward me, toward the course that I had taken, which were daily more and more manifested against me. I tried every way I could to convince my wife and family, whom I most sincerely and most ardently loved, and to conciliate my views with theirs. So basically he's trying to convince them to convert as well, but that's not going over well. Let's continue. Upon the following 15th of May, 1849, so now we're in May of 1849, he's back in Philadelphia, at the request of my wife and son Jacob, an inquisition of lunacy was issued against me. What does that mean? That basically they're saying that he is not all there, and so therefore he shouldn't have a say on the finances and things like that. So now he writes in this book, which remember he published in 1852. So he's writing in this book about this case. And he dedicates a lot of pages to this case because it actually went to trial. So one of the things that they said, they brought a whole bunch of pieces of evidence that he's out of his mind. So one of the things they said is that the 9th point was that he insists upon his wife Elizabeth becoming a Jewess. So what was his response? So he says, this I only wished upon her becoming most honestly and deeply convinced of the truth of Judaism as Ruth was. So yeah, I wanted her to become Jewish, but not just to do it, only if she would do it sincerely. And once I understood she's not going to do it sincerely, so then I gave up. So that's one of the things that he says. Anyway, it went to trial. There was actually a jury, and he publishes the newspaper clippings that came out then in his book. So here we'll just read one of them. He has a ton of it. So he writes us, this is May 19th, 1851. That's when this trial happens. So the newspaper is the Public Ledger, and it reports, Warder Cresson's case, which was under trial all last week, was concluded today. David Paul Brown, who was the lawyer for the family, made an able speech in summing up the testimony to prove Mr. Cresson's insanity and incapacity to manage his pecuniary affairs. Pecuniary, fancy word for money. Quoting many of the letters he had written from Jerusalem, which were, he said, of an extraordinary character, and which he urged could not have been written by a sane mind. So that's the lawyer from the other side. Judge King made a brief but lucid charge to the jury, under which they retired to deliberate upon the verdict. A short time after 3 o'clock, the jury returned into court with a verdict in favor of the defendant, that is, in favor of Mr. Cresson, that is deciding that Mr. Cresson was of sound mind. Okay, so this is one of the newspaper clippings that happens. This is in 1851. He wins his case. Soon thereafter, he goes back to Eretz Yisrael. This individual goes back to Eretz Yisrael. We have in the Occident, the same newspaper we've been quoting a lot, where there's an article. What's the date? The date is 1854, so this is a few years later. And the headline is Relief by Agriculture for Palestine. Many people were worried about what's going on with the Yidden in Eretz Yisrael. The system is not sustainable. They're being supported by tzedakah from Chutz La'aretz. It's not working, and all of that. This is before Zionism. It's even before Chayvei Tzion. But there are people who are talking about what can we do about maybe starting some agricultural program in Eretz Yisrael that's going to change the situation over there. So they quote, the editor of the Occident quotes a letter that they just received from Mr. Warder Cresson. We know exactly who he is. In this letter, Mr. Cresson basically lays out a plan, how he wants to introduce that instead of living off tzedakah, many of the people in Eretz Yisrael will start getting involved in agriculture. This is in the year 1854. And in this letter that's published in the Occident, he basically says that, look, I'm not really dying for this position of leadership here, but I just want to let you know the facts. The facts are that in Philadelphia, when I was a non-Jew, I had a few farms. They were derelict when I bought them. I turned them over into very, very productive farms. I know what I'm doing, and I totally couldn't do this. That's the thrust of his letter. He signs, this is a very important project, all-important undertaking, and most important it is to the future welfare of our poor brethren in the Holy Land. Most respectfully, Michal Boyaz Yisrael, formerly Warder Cresson. So here we're introduced to his Hebrew Jewish name. Boyaz, no surprise over there. Remember, the story of Ruth was very meaningful for him. He's the first signature here, and under him is a Rabbi Marcus, a Benjamin Lilienthal, Moshe Sachs, another Yid Rafael. Each one of these individuals known for their attempt to try to do something agricultural related in this time, but he is the one who's signing first because he wants to be involved. He wants to do something. And he tried and he tried. Unfortunately, nothing of significance came of his efforts. And now we go to the Occident a few years forward in 1861, just a few months before the Civil War. This is January 1861, where there is an article that says as follows. The Jewish Chronicle, which comes out of London, December 14th, brings us the news of the demise of Michal Boyaz Israel, otherwise known as Warder Cresson, the well-known proselyte to Judaism. So that, if you go back to that original article where someone in 1854 found him almost dying with smallpox, and I said, he's just putting his name there. Yeah, he was by 1854, all Jews in America knew the name Warder Cresson. Everyone knew the name Warder Cresson. Now he passes away in 1861, or actually he passes away in 1860, but it's reported here in 1861. His death occurred on Shabbos, Cheshvan 11, which is October 27th, 1860, in Yerushalayim. That's where he embraced Judaism 13 years ago. His age must have been about 68. After his forsaking Christianity and failing in his return home to convert his family to his new belief, he was charged with being a lunatic, and then the article gives a summary of the case. He contributed often in years past to our periodical under various signatures. He actually wrote articles in the Occident in previous years. His piety was sincere and undoubted. And had he been seconded by the inhabitants of the Holy Land, he might have been enabled to do much for the introduction there of agricultural and husbandry. So if he would have been allowed by the Yidden in Eretz Yisrael, maybe he could have got something done over there in terms of agriculture, but his attempts ended in nothing. It is difficult to say where the fault lies. Okay, he ends, may he meet with the peace which is destined for the righteous, signed L, that's Isaac Leeser, who's the editor of this paper. Here is the Matzeva on Har HaZeisim. If you look well, you should be able to see toward the top. It says, Kanfei Hashchina, or Lechasa is Tachas Kanfei Hashchina. That's language we use for a ger, who comes to become part of the Jewish people. You should also be able to see his name, Michal Boyaz Yisrael. And then it says, Niftar Lebeis Halamai Biyoim. And it says, I actually wouldn't know how to read that word, but now that I saw there that it was 11 cheshvan, I think we need to read this Aleph Yud Cheshvan. I don't see any other way of reading this. It is interesting that it's done as an Aleph Yud Cheshvan, Tov Reish Chaf Aleph. That's the end of the year of 1860. A few years ago, a new monument was placed over there where it says he was the first U.S. consul to Jerusalem. Okay, fine. He actually did get a commission. It just happened to be revoked. Now, we've done two stories here today. We did the halachic story that's been widely discussed over the last 150 years or so in the halachic literature about the ger observing Shabbos in that unique situation. And then we said the story of Warder Cresson. As far as I know, this individual, Rabbi Yirmiyah Malevsky, is the first person to tie these two stories together, because he points out that the 28th of March, 1848, the day Warder Cresson became Michal Boyaz Yisrael, that corresponds perfectly to the 23rd of Adar Sheni in the Jewish year. And remember, Reb Asher Lemel's letter said clearly that the date was Chaf Gimel Adar. And remember, there weren't multiple Gerim going on that day in Yerushalayim, because then we would have heard about it. Because, yeah, well, that's what we did for the other one, or what we did do for the other one, we didn't do for the other one. No, they said, well, once in a while, when there's a Ger here, we remember. So there was one Ger that happened in Yerushalayim at that time. So it's the time, it's the place, it's a perfect match. So now we know the individual who was crying on that Shabbos in Tov Reish Ches in the year 1848 was none other than Michal Boyaz Yisrael, otherwise formerly known as Warder Cresson. Now we have one issue, though, to deal with. If you remember, the tshuva of the Binyan Tzion said that this guy came from Morocco. And I asked, if he came from Morocco, he doesn't need a bris, he could just do a tafas dam bris. So Rabbi Malevsky writes, we should assume he did not come from Morocco, but rather from America, which is where Warder Cresson came from. In Hebrew, the spelling of America can be easily mistaken for Morocco. Morocco, America, similar letters over there. And so in this letter that Asher Lemel sent to the Binyan Tzion, where the Binyan Tzion produced it in his shuvas, maybe some error was introduced. Was it introduced by Asher Lemel himself when he wrote it? Was it introduced by, I don't know, if Asher Lemel had a copyist that made a copy before sending it? Was it introduced by the Binyan Tzion himself when he put it into his tshuva? Was it introduced by the printer? I don't know at what stage this was introduced, but he's suggesting that it's not so different, America and Morocco. And so really, that's what we're dealing with over here. Very, very reasonable. I just want to add to this conversation one last detail. And that is, that if you go back to the Shomer Tzion HaNeman, and you go back, that's where I told you, where Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger published, not all, but a lot more of Asher Lemel's letter. So if we look over there, this is from the issue Kuf Nun Dalid, Iyar Tov Reish Yud Gimel, 1853. So if you go to the place where he brings it, the beginning of the tshuva, he writes, Yelmadenu Rabbeinu Be'uvda, the exact language, the way he has it in Binyan Tzion. But he says, Eina Yehudi Echad Shaba Heina Mimedinas, and it does not say Morocco here. I don't know what it does say here. It seems to me like it says Parkika or something like that. In other words, yeah, he didn't know what it said. And so when he printed it in Binyan Tzion, it came out one way. When he printed it over here in his Shomer Tzion HaNeman, it came another way. And I think this only buttresses and supports the idea that there was some probably unclear writing over here that most definitely once said America. And here it came out as Pei Aleph with a patach under it, Reish Kuf Kuf, Aleph with a kametz. Whoa, what's an ayin? What's an ayin? The first letter is an ayin? The first letter is an ayin?
It looks like an iron from where I'm sitting.
America, I don't know. Even if it is an ayin, I don't think we have a perfect match, but I think it's very clear. We're dealing here with the United States of America. It's Warder Cresson. We know exactly who this individual was, and what a story this is. What a poignant story. A real life story, a fascinating halachic topic, very much connected to the parsha of Lech Lecha, the parsha of Bris, the parsha of this very, very important mitzvah that we all have. And his yahrzeit is coming up, because his yahrzeit is at Aleph Cheshvan. So his yahrzeit is coming up. What was that? And he started off by Kever Rachel, and we did see in that article that is by Kever Rachel, and he shares a yahrzeit with Kever Rachel, with Rachel Imenu as well.